Good evening, everyone. I'm Billy. I'm an alcoholic. Welcome to the Monday night service workshop. We appreciate you being here. I'm going to preempt the regular um, topic tonight. We'll continue next week. First of all, I want to say, Suzanne, you look awesome, and we are praying for you, all of us. Thank you for being here tonight. Um, so, I just thought that I should get something on recording because truthfully, I wouldn't be sitting here tonight doing this, going through the service manual nonsense, if not for the man I'm going to talk about, George Dorsey. Um, but to just put it on tape a little bit, and that way some things don't get lost in time. I mean, proudly, this sits right. If you walk into my house, this picture is right there. And I'm going to get to it. Like, that doesn't mean him and I always agreed, because sometimes we didn't. But he lived a spectacular, courageous, ridiculous life. Um, and like, you know, I even feel there's more a disturbance in the force than when Ozzy died. And for someone like me, that is a big statement. Okay. Um, like, it's just unbelievable to think that he's no longer here. So I want to basically tell you a couple of things. Number one, you should know about him. Um, he went to the University of Chicago Law School, but as he would tell you, nobody told him he had to go to class. That was the problem. He got into the University of Chicago Law School, but he didn't know going to class was so required. Like, they were very strict in law school. And that was during World War II. And when he got thrown out of law school, he was going to get drafted. He knew that, so he joined the Navy. He enlisted in the Navy, and the war came to an end. But he was enlisted. He wasn't drafted, so he didn't get released right away. And obviously, another thing called Korea came along and was bubbling up at that time. And as George would tell you, he was sitting minding his own business in Waukegan, Illinois, which, if you've never been there, it's right on the shores of Lake Michigan, north of Chicago. It's like Siberia, basically, in the winter. It is freezing there. And, a good old fashioned corkboard, George would tell you, he saw a notice there that they were starting this experimental unit, which he didn't care about that, but it was in Coronado, California. And when George looked that up on the map, he was like, I don't know what this is, but I want to leave Waukegan, Illinois. And, what that was at that time called UDT, Underwater Demolition Frogmen, which is what the SEALs are. The first group of SEALs. And, a year later, he was in removing mines off the coast of Korea. And, I tell you that story with two follow-ups about George the man. The first is that I had never really heard him talk about anything he saw in the military or nothing. He never really talked about it a lot. But after he saw Saving Private Ryan, him and I were walking up Third Avenue in New York City. And I remember, I don't know what I was complaining about that day. This is a long, long time ago. But I remember him saying to me, I have a bunch of things that I could hang up on the wall, but none of them are for doing your dishes, Billy. And none of them are for going to work. And none of them are for staying an active member in AA. Like that's, you don't get medals for stuff like that. Like that's what you're expected to do. The other story I'm going to tell you, which is probably even hard to tell you, is so George, if you don't know this, I'm so glad this is recorded. George and Clancy came in around the same time in Los Angeles, but Clancy stayed sober and George did not. In fact, at that time, it was very common for you would walk into that clubhouse in Los Angeles and Clancy would put a note on the board, George is in jail again, or George is in detox again. And Clancy and George had a lifelong friendship for a long, long time. But it's funny because, I think I wound up working as an executive in the insurance industry. He worked as an executive in the insurance industry. But George wound up moving to Northern California, where he was a very active member of some groups there. And, he would always tell the story and he had no shame. He didn't care. He would tell you that, George's husband, Jim, died a bunch of years ago. And George always expected that he was going to die before Jim. And, Jim was the opposite of George, the exact opposite. I mean, Jim was amazing. I remember one time Jim telling a story of him and George were traveling in Connecticut and they were at a gay meeting. And Jim said all these single gay guys were all talking about how they want to be in a relationship. They're ready to be in a relationship. And when it became Jim's turn to share, he said, you want to be in a relationship? You want to be stuck with him? Let me tell you how good you have it being single. Like Jim was the best, the best. But I want to tell you about Jim's funeral because I have had dinner with Jim. I would not be able to count how many times or how many meetings in the 90s I went to with Jim and George. I never once heard Jim talk about his time in the military. Never once. In fact, it was news to me at his funeral that he did. And during his funeral, one of the speakers talked about that Jim was in an aircraft helicopter that went down in the Pacific Ocean with a couple of other sailors, officers. And a helicopter, the guy who told the story, came to rescue them, but did not have enough room for all of them. And Jim, as the highest ranking officer in the water, said to everyone else goes first, I go last, like you come back and get me. Which is incredible that I never heard that story before. But what's really incredible is George lived in a building on the Upper East Side, actually in the old Jefferson's building. If you remember that show, George lived in that building right next to it. And in typical George fashion, there was going to be a gathering at the top of their condo building for after Jim's funeral. And everyone was taking Ubers or maybe taxis at the time. And George said to me at the back of the room, he said, yeah, I ain't taking a taxi. I'm smoking a cigar on the way back to the reception. So George and I smoked a cigar and walked like 20 blocks or whatever. And when we got to their building, a couple of people who were at Jim's memorial service got in the elevator with us. And I remember one of the people turning around and saying, Um, God, George, I didn't know Jim was in the service. Um, I never heard that story before. That was really incredible. And another guy in the elevator turned around and said, George, you were in the service too, weren't you? And I'll never forget George's answer. He just said, yeah, but I was in the Navy. I swept off some decks of some ships. Like Jim was, an officer and shot down. And I just think about that. Like he didn't say, oh, yeah, I was in part of the first group of Navy SEALs. I was a frogman. I was in the underwater demolition teams. He didn't say anything like that. He just downplayed it and said, yeah, I swept some decks on a Navy ship, but Jim was an officer. And it's just amazing to witness those things. It's like in the early days of Starbucks, the Upper East Side is a kind of affluent area. And so one of the first Starbucks in New York City was on the Upper East Side. And I remember one time George took like two or three of us to grab coffees. And George went to pay with $100 bill, which $100 to me at that time might as well have been $10 million. And I remember the guy behind the counter pointing to a sign and saying to George, oh, we don't take anything larger than a 20. And, he didn't even reach in his pocket to grab a credit card or whatever, or a debit card. He looked at the kid and he said, do you and these other people, you all in college going to school? And he said, yeah. And I remember George just gave him the $100 bill and said, just split this amongst all of yous. Um, like those are lifelong lessons. Um, the other thing I tell you about Jim and George, it's so funny, George was Jim's sponsor early on. And another guy went to Jim, and said, you got to get rid of that George character as a sponsor. I think he likes you. Like, you got to get rid of him. And, he wound up getting a new sponsor and they wound up going out. And, sometimes you hear people say all kinds of things about telling other people how to have relationships in AA. And I know people that are the king and queen big book thumpers who got married, who had orders of protection going both ways in 6 months. And I know people who've met in the halfway house who somehow have put 4 kids through college and are enjoying their retirement. Like, it reminds me so much of George because if anything, he had amazing practical life advice. And I haven't even got to service yet, but his mind around practicality and keeping your eye on the ball of, is what we're doing for the newcomer or not, was amazing. So I used to go to this meeting on Friday nights. It was called Regency. They had 3 meetings. They had a speaker meeting, a 3-speaker meeting, typical New York. Another group comes in and brings 3 speakers. They had a step meeting. And then they had this lunatic beginners meeting, like at 9:30. And that's the first time I ever remember seeing George. All I knew was there was this crazy guy, it seemed, who seemed to be poor because he would put his cigar in the planter on 86th Street so that he could relight it after the meeting, right? So all I thought was, this is just some poor soul in AA. So funny when you make judgments like that. One of the only things I ever remember being in a meeting in Regency with him is one night the topic at the beginners meeting was honesty. And I remember when it got to George to share, he said, this is a horrible topic for beginners in Alcoholics Anonymous. And then he said, Don't lie, I pass, right? That's what he shared. About a year after that, Ikipa had been in New York, which I'll get to. I was a GSR. I got on the Ikipa Advisory Council, and a past delegate from Southeast New York named Jimmy D from the Bronx, which he still hates that he's now Jimmy D from Connecticut. But at that time, everybody knew him. He was Jimmy D from the Bronx, and he had earrings in his ears. And he was a young delegate at that time. He was like in his young 40s when he was a delegate. And he was super passionate in AA. And Jimmy told me to meet him at the 11 o'clock meeting at GSO and that we would go on the tour. And, I remember going on the tour that day, and we would just, if anyone's, I'm sure a lot of people here have been on the tour, you go to the archives, you go to finance, you go to records, you go to publishing, you stop at all the offices, the corrections and public information. I remember somebody saying that was giving us the tour, oh, let's see if the general manager is in. If he is, we'll stop in and say hello. And when we got down to the corner of the building at 475 Riverside Drive at the general manager's office, I remember the woman giving the tour said, oh, we're lucky he's in. Come on into the office. And I remember walking in there and thinking, this is the lunatic from the Friday night meeting who puts his cigars in the planter. Now, I want to tell you, like I talked about George last night because I spoke in a meeting and my cigar was on the patio, half smoked. It's so funny how life comes full circle. But like that's where I really got to know, like I realized who George was that day. Because, one of the things George had some pet peeves, but I'm going to tell you a couple of things about meeting George in regular AA. Number one, sometimes I would go to him and I'd tell him something I just heard in AA. And he would be like, who told you that? And I'd be like, Dennis from the Wednesday night meeting. And he would always say, was Dennis there? And I'd say, where? He'd say, Akron, like in 1935. Was Dennis in Akron in 1935? I said, no, Dennis has like 6 years. And he'd like, you got to do your own research, Billy. You got to do your own reading. You got to check everything you hear. I remember that so much. But the real thing I want to talk about, George, in regular everyday AA, George loved the 79th Street Workshop. It's at St. Monica's Church at 79th and 1st in Manhattan. It's not big, pretty AA. It's all types from Park Bench to Park Avenue, from doormen to bankers. But, if you met George at a meeting, and even if you went to the diner with him after, I will tell you a couple of things you will never learn from him. You will never know that he was a frogman in the underwater demolition teams. You will never know that he was the general manager at GSO, even when sometimes current during the time he was. You would never know that he was a delegate. You would just know that he loved AA. That's it. George used to always say, Billy, make people pry information out of you. Make them have to get to know you. And when you meet people, You don't need to lead with your accomplishments. Like, sometimes that'll do more harm than good with people, you would say. Um, you know, obviously I love young people in AA and the International Conference of Young People in AA. George loved young people in AA. In fact, there might even be some people here who have been on the younger side of being a delegate, and all these fancy people who are much older dying to get George to be their best buddy or steal time with George. And George always made the marginalized person feel welcome. And so many young people in service. George wrote a couple of letters in the 90s that I still see on young people's websites today. Like, when people say Ikipa isn't part of AA or young people this, like, it's funny. I was looking in my, back in the day when I used to get those calls about so-and-so delegate just said that young people aren't part of AA and Ikipa is not AA and all this other stuff. If I go to my Ikipa file, sub-file George Dorsey, October 15th, 1998. Dear Nathan, thanks for a good letter about the recent Ikipa conference in Washington, D.C. Yes, I was totally energized after that terrific weekend, as I always been at young people's events. In your letter, Nathan, you asked about providing information and experience regarding young people's groups and conferences. You were interested in a copy of Bill Wilson's 1960 address to the fellowship concerning Ikipa and young people's groups in AA. This is what Bill stated in May 9th, 1960. I wish to send the meeting my warmest congratulations and my high confidence for its success. For us old timers, the coming of so many younger members into AA is one of the deepest satisfactions that we can ever have. To think that so many are to be spared the extra 10 or of years of unmitigated hell that so many of us had to pass through, it is something for the greater of gratitude. In a letter to Bob C. on June 24th, Bill said, in my view, among the younger members of our fellowship have been of the most inspiring developments that we oldest have seen, that such great numbers have been and will continue to be spared the last agonizing years of alcoholism. And then he says, Nathan, having been involved in young people's groups in San Francisco and attending several Ikipa conferences, I can assure you that young people's groups, conventions, and conferences are vital activities in Alcoholics Anonymous. We encourage you to continue to communicate with the area, get young people involved in service work, get them to be GSRs, DCMs, correction, treatment, CPC. Invite the area officers to young people's activities and make sure the young people's groups attend area assemblies and service weekends. There have been conference presentations on young people, 1985, 86, and Grapevine articles. If you're ever in New York, Nathan, do not hesitate to stop by and visit. I would love to meet you. As you know, my retirement will be in a few short months and my successor will be named. We at GSO are always inspired by young people's conventions and wish you well and encourage you to keep trying. May your sobriety be sustained by the day through the AA fellowship and its program of recovery. Warmest regards, George. Like, he wrote that letter because some area delegate was telling some young kid that Ikipa was not AA. Ah, God. Let me tell you a classic George story that's not as official as the letter. So, as you may know, when the general manager travels, or sometimes when trustees travel, the people who are super into service to the 100th power will track them down and try to hang out with them, right? George had a house in Maui forever, and he used to go to the Kihei early risers meeting. But Ikipa was in Hawaii in 1995, and George wasn't at that Ikipa, but he was out to breakfast after the meeting, and the delegate was there. And the delegate couldn't wait to tell George the laundry list of problems with Ikipa. And the delegate said, George, you wouldn't believe what was going on at the pool. And you wouldn't believe the small bathing suits they were wearing. And George, on Sunday night after the conference, they had a bonfire on the beach on the north side of the island, and they all went skinny dipping. And George looked right at that delegate and said, really? I better get to the gym immediately because they asked me to speak at Ikipa next year, and there is no way I can go skinny dipping in the shape I am in currently. George had a miraculous grasp on service and the fellowship. And I'm going to tell you another lesson I learned from him. My first conference as a delegate, George had just left as general manager. But George was general manager during the San Diego convention. And during the San Diego convention and after, there was a, let's call it the plain language big book of the day, right? It was the San Diego money, right? How resentful do we get in New York? There's still a meeting in Southern California called FNY. I don't have to tell you what it stands for. That's what they registered as with GSO, FNY, okay? There was a lot of controversy around the buses and money and a whole bunch of things. And, I showed up as the youngest delegate that year in 99, and it was definitely going to be talked about. And I want to tell you that I did not agree with George on that topic. I voted a different way than he would have voted that day. But that's because of something that he taught me a long time ago. If you really think you've done your job as a service sponsor or a sponsor, the surefire way of knowing is that someone who considers you a service sponsor is voting opposite than you, but you still leave agreeing to disagree. You still leave with immense gratitude for the group conscience process and for the minority opinion process. I remember one day at Glurkipa, the last Glurkipa, which is now called ECPA, but it was in Philadelphia, the Great Lakes Conference of Young People in AA. And I remember seeing George playing checkers right next to like the river, right? With somebody, chess, not checkers. George would hate me if I said that. He was playing chess. And he was playing with another young kid, chess. And all of a sudden, two kids threw another kid in the river, in the water. And everybody kind of like flipped out like it was going to be big trouble. And George was like, oh, this is AA. This is young people's AA. And, that was George's message about the bonfire and the pool. Like his message to people was always, 22-year-olds do stupid things. It doesn't matter if they're drunk, sober drunks. They're immature and irresponsible. But it's our job to make sure they're welcome in AA. And, I am so entirely grateful I think I learned how to tip properly in restaurants in a diner at the corner of 86th and First Avenue from George. Um, just really unbelievable. I think what I'm going to do is I would ask, there's some people in here that knew George for a long time or were very close to George. And if you are one of those people and you want to share for 2 or 3 minutes, I want to give you that opportunity, because I want the generations to come, when some lunatic tells them that Ikipa is not part of AA, to be able to hear about a man named George, who is in some ways as simple as possible and in other ways as sophisticated as they come. So if you raise your virtual hand, um, and you're one of those people like I was talking about, I will call on you and unmute you. I know there's a couple of you in here. Janine, go ahead. You have 2 minutes.
Thanks, Billy. My name's Janine. I'm an alcoholic, and I met George at the round table in 1998. I went to the Prasa up in Idaho, and at midnight we did the round table on archives. And I met several people there, and he reached out and he made me feel welcome. It was my first time being at a conference like that, and he ended up introducing me to Frank Mauser, but absolutely made me feel welcome and ended up being very much into archives, but was something else. Anyway, thank you for sharing, and I'll remember George.
Thank you. Thank you for sharing. Who else would like to say something? Oh, he is out from the way past. Terry, you are unmuted.
Thanks, Billy. Yeah, it's funny. About 6 weeks ago back, I picked George up at his house on 79 or 80th Street and Third Avenue, and we wanted him to come down and speak at the Templeton group. And I picked it up, and I spent some time up there with him, and we drove him down to the Templeton group. We drove him back home, and George is one of those guys who's always low key. You wouldn't know. You wouldn't know he was a general manager. Or you wouldn't know he was a past trustee or a past delegate. None of that stuff. You just knew him as a regular guy sitting at the meeting who was just another sober man who shared his experience. That was around a long time, and I think that was the beauty of George. He never wanted to be an AA member. We always talk about Bill, and Bill says, let us be an AA member too. And I think George fits into that category. Just wanting to be an AA member, enjoyed the experience of being a member, just being another, as we say sometimes, another bozo on the bus trying to get sober and trying to help another alcoholic. But I had a real nice time getting him down to 850th Street to the meeting. He did a great job at the meeting. He's not a kid, wasn't a kid anymore. And he got up there, but he talked for 25 minutes, and everybody was on the edge of their seat after he finished talking. He didn't talk about GSO and he didn't talk about any of that. He just shared his experience strength about getting sober in California and some of the stories he had from California. So thanks a lot, Billy. I love your meeting. Thanks a lot, brother.
Thanks, Terry. Really good to see you. Really good. George would often talk about those early days when he was still drinking, and his sponsor's wife would have alcohol there so that George wouldn't flip out, like good old fashioned AA. The person still drinking, welcome. Who else would like to share? I'll give it a minute or two. I know for some people, like, listen, I couldn't stop crying the whole time, so it's a hard subject to talk about. Joanne, you're unmuted.
Hi, everybody. Joanne, alcoholic. I'm from Winnipeg, Canada. I met George when I was delegate, and I also, got to know him a little better when I became trustee later on. But I always, he was interested. He wanted to know where I was from, and he still had in his memory bank people from here that he served with. That resonated with me that he, and I see that as we serve, we do remember certain people, but he knew a lot about them. And then I also had the privilege after, coming to New York a few times and not serving anymore, just being a guest and sitting on the bus with him on the tour. I'll never forget some of those conversations that I had with him. Like, they're special. I love folks that just keep all those memories so alive in themselves, and how, and I did go to the 79th Street group a few times. Madeline and I went there, and it was really fun to actually sit in the room. It's nice to go to somebody's group, to the place where they're sobriety, where they're just members of AA. And I don't think that he tried to be anything else. I know he certainly loved to know what was going on, and just like the rest of us. But I think inside he was a really good man, and I appreciate everyone here tonight. And thanks, Bill, for your love. I feel your love. So thank you for sharing it with us.
Thank you. Good to see you, Joanne. Woody, I'm unmuting you.
Thank you, Billy. Yeah, I've known George for over 30 years, being from the California northern part. And I remember the first time I met George, I think it was in 96. And I was really impressed. I was an alternate district committee member at that time, and I was in awe of people like George. And but he took the time to chat with me and made me feel comfortable. And he was always, we would always see him at Pacific region events. And of course, he was delegate in Area 6 and later regional trustee. And he used to tell the story about the area I'm from, interior area, Northern California, where people were in an uproar over a video. I think it was Hope, and people felt that they were betrayed by New York, and they wanted to impeach the General Service Office manager, Bob P. at that time. And George, being the regional trustee, had to go up and down the area to kind of put out all the fires and settle things. And that was the talent I think that George had. I always felt calm around him. And the lessons I got from being around him was, don't take things so serious. Um, like you mentioned a few times, do your own research. Um, People will be people. That's A is a lot of things, and he's gonna be missed. I mean, I used to see him all over the place. He used to say that about me. I I, I wish I could have got to know him as well as a lot of people up in the East Coast and you, but my life is enriched having known him. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Woody. Eric, you should be able to unmute.
Everybody, I'm Eric. Eric. Yeah, I met George when I had 4 months sober because I hung out with this woman called Diane O. She was my sponsor. Diane would love to be here too, and I'll tell a few Diane and George stories because they went way back. Um, but yeah, Diane just said you should talk to this guy. He's gay, and so I thought she was trying to set me up with him, and I was like, Diane, I don't know. So, yeah, but he was always like I was just a random person. I didn't do general service. I had 4 months sober, but he took an interest in me and he was like kind. And then I became a GSR. He just kept saying, keep trying, keep doing, keep going. And I ended up being delegate for the area that he served as delegate. And so it's kind of like a cool story of like he kind of got to watch the whole part of it. Um, and then because Diane can't be here, she's at Applebee's. Um, she wanted me to tell everybody that uh, when she met George, so this is in the 1970s, her sponsor was an area officer and George was the delegate. And her sponsor took her to one of the meetings of the area officers. And uh, George just looked at Diane's sponsor. Her name was Pat. And she said, Pat, what are you doing with somebody that bad? Um, and yeah, Diane ended up becoming delegate, and they were very good friends. Diane was one of the Wicked Witches of the West, because at the time there were a bunch of women delegates from the Pacific region, and George was the regional trustee. And so it was like he just always was very, he was moving AA forward into being more inclusive and more welcoming. So it's no longer shocking or like I'm like at the conference when I was there, there were like, I mean, a third of us were like LGBTQIA2S plus, right? Like it was no longer exciting. Like women delegates are common now. It's not a novelty anymore. And I think that George was always pushing AA to be more welcoming, more inclusive at every level of service, including at the office. I mean, so I'm just really grateful that I got to know him in that like very small way. But Diane really wanted me to tell that story, so I did. Thanks.
Thanks, Eric. Please say hello to Diane for me. Jennifer, you should be able to unmute.
Thanks, Billy. Jennifer, alcoholic. Thank you so much for sharing the stories about George. And, my experience, I met him probably because of you. I think I met him before I was delegate, but I remember most vividly the time of getting to spend some really just one-on-one time, because anytime George was around, everybody wanted George's time. And it was hard to kind of talk to him. But I was a young delegate and, I had gone through years of being told, you're not part of Alcoholics Anonymous. Young People's isn't this. And so George was just one of those people that championed and cheered on um, people in service, whether you're young, whether you're different in any way. And I felt that love. And I think that when I think about my old timers and I think about the giants of Alcoholics Anonymous, that's what they do for us is they cheer for us, when we feel like we're the minority voice. And he made me feel special. And I have one of my favorite pictures was underneath the 13th step bar in New York City with George. And he was just also fun. And I just think it's important that we also as members like implement the things of like having fun, not taking ourselves too serious, and I just think that like he lived out these principles of showing us how to do those things. And it reminds me not to be too serious and to have fun, and to be an example of people like George. And so I just feel really honored and privileged to be one of the people that he touched. And I know like people have like deep connections, and my heart has really been broken for my friends that had really, really close relationships with him. And you all are in my prayers and my thoughts. And we are so blessed to have that love of Alcoholics Anonymous and people like George who teach us how to live that out. And so I just feel really grateful that I got to have one-on-one time with George and to know him over the years. So thanks.
Thanks, Jennifer. I really appreciate the people who shared. You know, Eric reminded me of Diane O. Her and George were very tight. And so I will say prayers for everybody tonight who is missing their buddy George. So with that, we will close in the usual manner, just with the responsibility statement. That's what we do here. And thank everyone for being here tonight. it was really helpful to me to be able to talk about George a little bit. So after a moment of silence, we'll get out of here with the responsibility statement. I am responsible when anyone anywhere reaches out for help. I want the hand of AA always to be there. Next week, we will return to another chapter in the service manual. So thanks, everyone. Have a good night.